afternoon, everyone. My name is David Field. I'm the Interim CEO of the Marketing Institute of Ireland, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our 7th webinar in the webinar series brought to you by the Marketing Institute of Ireland. I think I'm sure for any of you who've been on these webinars already know that we have an action-packed calendar going into May and June, and this is filling up regularly. So we've at least 1 to 2 webinars a week. So if you haven't got visibility of that, I suggest you go on to mii.ie or alternatively sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already done so, and that will give you a weekly update on all the content that we have planned during the current times. I suppose let's just jump straight into it. The team, I suppose, on an ongoing basis are looking to get, I suppose, thought leaders and experts in their field to kind of share their thoughts and insights on, I suppose, what they're experiencing and also what they're working through at the moment. And I'm delighted to say that we are welcomed, that I can welcome 3 expert speakers today. We have Dale Wood, who is the Strategic Consulting Director of Dentsu Aegis Network. Dale has over 25 years experience working across 3 continents in various marketing consulting roles. She has worked with clients across multiple categories, delivering sustainable revenue, growth through expertise in brand positioning, marketing, and utilizing data to uncover needs and insights. So we're delighted to have Dale. We also have Dawn Spencer from Kerry Foods. Dawn is a marketing category director for Kerry Foods, as well as the Innovation Director for Great Britain and Ireland for Kerry Foods. So as you can appreciate, Dawn is an FMCG professional with over 18 years experience, so a wealth of experience working on iconic brands, not just in Ireland, but in the UK and the Middle East. And as I said, she currently heads up the innovation pipeline for Kerry across Great Britain and Ireland. So I'm sure Dawn is extremely busy with that. And Claire O'Rourke has joined us as well, and she's a research lead in Dentsu. And Claire is an experienced dual researcher with qualitative and quantitative experience, and she also has a background in psychology. So Claire has worked on a range of private and public sector clients and always seeks to explore the motivations and triggers to look at predicting rather than describing behavior. So I think we're in for a real treat. And both Dale, Dawn and Claire are going to talk to us today about the conscious consumer. And this is a study into the motivational levers impacting consumers in Ireland. And as you can appreciate, as we all know today, consumers are more informed and more aware and discerning when it comes to how they think about their purchasing and consumption. Not only are they increasingly changing their behavior for health and environmental impact reasons, but everything from gender equality and new product alternatives are changing how they behave and, more importantly, how they buy. So I suppose for us as marketeers, it's imperative to understand the drivers behind that behavior from a consumer perspective. So before I hand over to Dale, Dawn and Claire, just a couple of points in relation to the webinar. The content will be recorded and will be sent out to members after the session. I'd appreciate, obviously, if you all have your Zoom on mute. There will be questions and answers throughout. So if you do have any questions, please post them on the chat and I'll facilitate a Q&A at the end. And we like to kind of make sure that the content that we're delivering for our members at the moment is really, really relevant. So if you could take the opportunity to share your thoughts in relation to content that you'd like to see more of, we'll endeavour to facilitate that. So listen, thanks a million, and I look forward to the Q&A at the end of this. So I will hand over to Dale now. Thanks a million.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this quite rainy Thursday afternoon. And we're excited to share with you the work that we've done today. I suppose the most important thing that I want to just kick off with saying is that this is not COVID-19 research. So this research was actually done prior to the pandemic impacting Ireland, and also that it was done prior to the lockdown. So obviously so much has changed over the last few weeks and months. Having said that, as we looked at the data that this research uncovered, we still think that this is incredibly valid information, and at a very, very minimum, even understanding how consumers went into this lockdown stage will help us understand not only how we're behaving today within lockdown, but more importantly, starting to understand what are things going to look like as we exit this pandemic. So what I want to do first, before I introduce Dawn to you, is just give you a little bit of a playbook in terms of how we want to look at how we're going to spend the next hour. Claire, if you wouldn't mind clicking to the next slide. So we are hoping to take you through the work with starting off with Dawn, who's going to give you a perspective from a seasoned marketing professional in terms of the importance of putting consumer at the center of our marketing strategy. What I'm going to do then, after Dawn's spoken to you, is just take you through some of the big themes that we saw emerging from this work. And then Claire's going to spend 20 minutes taking you through a lot of the detail. I suppose I just want to mention at this stage, there is buckets more information available. So if there's anything that piques your interest, or if you want to get more information on, we've got a lot more information. So at any point, please reach out to either myself or Claire, and we'll be happy to share with you more information. So on that note, I'm going to hand you over to Dawn, and I'll be speaking to you again in a few minutes.
Thank you, Dale. Good afternoon, everybody. If I could click to the first slide, please, Claire. Thank you very much. When the team asked me to join this webinar today to talk about the importance of putting the consumer at the heart of marketing strategy, I was immediately whisked back to an early time in my career when I first learned this lesson. And a marketer's job, although currently distracted by clicks, likes, follows, and a bit of COVID, it hasn't changed. It's still all about listening to people and getting a deep understanding of what they need and want. It is cliche to say we live in a time of unprecedented change, but it's true. But the point here is that the brands that will succeed in today's cacophony of life are those that continue to understand consumers' needs, wants, and desires more than anyone else. The ever-moving variables of competitive pressure, the economic environment, and technological advances is leaving us and our businesses and brands in a constant state of flux. Even the success stories of our age, Google, Amazon, are constantly changing and evolving. But let's be clear, they never fail to put the consumer at the heart of everything that they do. And whilst we find ourselves in a permanent state of flux, I would argue that it's not just the importance of putting the consumer at the heart of everything that we do, it's actually the reality of realizing a truly consumer-centric marketing strategy in today's world. So a question for you all to consider as I make my way through this presentation today is a strategic question that drives your marketing strategy or your business strategy today defaulting to what else can you make or do? Or are you really being asked, what more can you do for your consumers? So I'm going to explore all of this in a little bit more detail in the next 8 to 10 minutes, looking at firstly the discipline of strategy and reminding you all of the role you need to play here, uncovering how you get your audience, and more importantly, reveal consumer truths. And finally, touch on the challenges of realizing this truly consumer-centric marketing strategy. Next slide, please, Claire. So strategy. Strategy and the discipline of strategy is a value-added activity. And I've found that it really shines through when it can be used to affect significant consumer behavior change. The real role of strategy is also about finding new growth by answering the big questions that face your organization or your brand. And resolving these fundamental questions should be questions that are about direction rather than what else you can do or what more you can make. So force yourselves and others to step beyond the conditions that have delivered success in your businesses to date. And to quote the good old management guru, Charles Handy, allow your brand or business to recurve in order to find new sources of success or means of serving the end consumer. And be prepared for this to take the form of new products, propositions, or positioning, depending on the issues that you're facing. So each and every one of you on this call today can make the greatest contribution to your business and your brands by opening up entirely new sources of revenue and growth through acts of creative leadership. And by this, I don't just mean coming up with more things that you can do or make. Have the confidence to ask big strategic questions and solve big problems. Get your external agency teams on board and ask them the big questions too. In the earlier part of my career, I was always really guilty of thinking I always had to come up with all the answers myself. Share the questions and the problems that you're trying to solve, and you will be amazed by how your partners will actively lean in and help you. Next slide, please, Claire. So to put the consumers at the heart of your brand or business strategy, you have actually got to get to them and understand them. Now, it may sound funny to even ask this question, but how often do you speak to your consumers? And how well do you really understand them when it comes to developing new products or services? Consumers now represent a complex mix of baby boomers, Gen Xers, Gen Yers, unicorns, and even snowflakes. New terminology I'm still trying to get my head around. But the point is here that each group has its own specific needs, wants, and desires. And without gaining insights into these new groups, you will never really be able to develop products that they want, or even promote them in a way that gains their attention. Some of the new questions I also believe we should be asking ourselves is, are you really getting down to the nitty-gritty of understanding why your consumers act in a certain way? Do you really understand how they share information with each other? Do you know what cultural influences are at work in shaping their perceptions and understandings? But get comfortable with the fact that this is now more difficult than ever. Remember, you need to accomplish all of this consumer insight gathering in the blink of a virtual eye, because the social media universe has made the consumer response swift and unrelenting. Products or services brought to market without delving into the reasons why consumers might want them can quickly and very unceremoniously be laughed off the internet shelf. I have also experienced social media influencers and advocates who have quickly built up my products that they like to talk to their circle of influence about, but then just as easily tear them down. So the world has changed dramatically, and it will continue to rapidly evolve. What appeals to consumers one day may not work the next. So it is fair to say that consumer-centric marketing is so much more than just a buzzword now, and I challenge us all, including myself, to improve how we get better insight into today's consumer behaviour. Next slide, please, Claire. So I've talked about getting to consumers, but what about revealing the truth? Well, getting meaningful feedback from consumers and revealing the truth actually takes meaningful investment. Crafting a consumer insights project that's dynamic, engaging, and offers a new experience to the complex mix of your participants is essential in order to draw out the useful insights. A brilliant moderator is genuinely worth their weight in gold in order for them to build up trust and rapport with your new consumer groups. And I know a few, if any of you are stuck. But in terms of using that, it's then time to skillfully ask your questions, sit back and carefully listen to the answers that you hear. And if you can master that art of listening to consumers in today's age, understanding their needs, and then develop products and services that meet those needs, then you can use it effectively, not only to be perhaps just a little bit more successful, but also to yield competitive advantage. However, a little word of warning, remember that the voice of the consumer and exactly what they say in those core groups or those focus groups shouldn't always reign supreme. And some of my biggest learnings in the far past few years have been paying heed to digital signals, reading and listening to in-store reviews, and engaging with data-savvy partners who can help uncover strategic insights about my shoppers, my consumers, and my brands. So come back to my earlier question, the challenges of realising a truly consumer-centric marketing strategy is never easy. In my career, I have found myself in situations where I have been asked to move faster, a little bit harder, and take market opportunities that have presented themselves, sometimes despite a lack of consumer insight and a notion of whether a new piece of NPD might be right or wrong. I touched on this in my opening statement, and I will repeat myself. Don't be swayed into delivering what you can make. Be brave and ask strategic questions that will drive your business forward. What else can you do for your consumers? Stay true to getting to know your consumers in the market, not just your factory or your products. And remember, it's no longer about just having better products. Stay focused on the needs of your consumers and always stand them at the core. Final slide, please, Claire. So to just make some closing statements from my presentation today, I am going to repeat myself again and say that the brands that will succeed in today's environment are those that understand consumers' wants, needs, and desires more than anyone else. The tools and techniques of marketing and brand and business building will change, but never put yourself in a position where you're out of touch or off pace with life and your consumers. You need these inputs to be able to make your mind do brilliant things and answer those big strategic questions. Otherwise, you will just find yourself falling into that trap of making more or doing more of the same things. There are many examples, and I even have to admit I have some of my own, where brands still work in silos in organisations, competing for budgets and exposure and focusing on their own targets, forgetting to share insights to win new consumers for the good of the wider business. So don't let this happen to you. Break down your business silos, share your insights, and pay heed to an array of inputs from consumers from a variety of sources to help you become even more successful in today's world. And finally, realising a truly consumer-centric strategy is no longer just the job of the marketing team. So I urge you to think about storytelling your knowledge into a set of consumer truths that can empower every function in your organisation. From marketing department out, give every individual in the organisation an opportunity to connect with and understand the consumer. And while it's an excellent way to create alignment across company teams, it is, in my experience, also a better way to ensure that a brand is consistently demonstrating its ideals externally. So that's all from me today. Thank you for listening. Over to Dale to talk you through the second part of our webinar.
Thank you, Dawn, and I'm deeply grateful that Dawn was able to join us today, because I think what Dawn's highlighted for us is the enormous pressures that we face every day in terms of being able to take the time to hear the consumer. And that's no easy feat, because we probably have more data than ever in our context today. But I think this COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly the lockdown, has brought into grim focus the reality of not only making sure that the consumer is informing our brand and our brand positioning, but also making sure that we understand the context into which we're putting our communication, because that too can make or break a brand. And I think too often we only look at a very slim vertical of the information in terms of our brand category. And this is probably just an invitation to sit back and listen over the next half an hour or so in terms of a broader context about how the fact that consumers are using scooters to get to work may impact the way they think about our brands. Because there is a reality that consumers today are more informed and more discerning than ever before, and this certainly came out in the research, but also that they're making real behavioral changes around health reasons, around environmental reasons, and even the range of alternative products are really starting to drive the way our consumers think and behave. Next slide, please, Claire. So as I said, what I'm going to do today before I hand over to Claire is just talk about three really interesting things in the context of COVID that this data revealed. The first thing that I want to talk about is this idea of everything changes, but nothing changes. We've probably been impacted by one of the world's greatest crises over the last few months. And there is no doubt that things will never be the same again. But certainly some things seem to remain the same. And this is something I want to spend a little bit of time talking about. The second is the squeezed middle, and I'll talk about that. And the last is something I think the lockdown has really demonstrated for us, is this digital pivot. So the first thing I want to talk about is the three big concerns. Claire, if you wouldn't mind going on. The three big concerns that citizens in Ireland said they were most concerned about as we headed into the 2020. Health and mental health was the biggest concern at 52%. We asked the panel to rank their three biggest concerns. Climate change was the next biggest concern, and poverty, including inequality and unemployment, was the third biggest concern. And it is almost frightening to look at those three concerns and say, if we were asking people what their biggest concerns were today, I would think that these would possibly be the three biggest concerns that came to light. What will change with COVID is the weighting of these. I think poverty, inequality, and unemployment are clearly going to move up the agenda. And health and mental health certainly are going to be big issues. Climate change may change as we head out of COVID, but I think there's two scenarios around climate change. The one is we could stay with our behavior that says our safety is more important than the environment, and move away from some of the reusable, recyclable behaviors that have started to emerge. Or alternatively, we could understand better the impact of the human footprint on our environment by simply not being there and seeing the reality of what we're doing to our planet. And we could quickly return to some of those really good behaviors. In terms of health and mental health, it was really interesting when you think about the torrid year that 2019 represented from a health point of view, with cervical checks crisis, with a shortage of beds, with a shortage of GPs and consultants in our health system, with mental health services greatly lacking in this country. It wasn't really that surprising that this was so high on the agenda as we moved into the 2020. And certainly it was a big driver of the February elections outcome. Climate change was fascinating in the sense that it is the third most meaningful leverage point that consumers think about when they're buying products. And it does mean that as brands, we have to be aware of what we're doing and what we're saying. And Claire will go into a lot more detail around this, but in another piece of research that we've also been working on around sustainability, it's really interesting to understand the depth of knowledge amongst consumers is not necessarily there, but certainly when issues cut through, the behavior that changes around those issues is swift. So making sure that we are staying ahead of the curve as brands is really, really important. And then poverty, inequality, and unemployment. I think it came in at around 35% of consumers saying that this was one of their top three big concerns. And that was really interesting because as we ended out 2019, certainly consumer sentiment as measured by KBC's sentiment tracker was actually pretty low. It was a lot lower than it had been. And our economic outlook in terms of GDP growth was a lot lower than it had been in previous years. We were looking at, if you remember, the trade crisis between China and the US, obviously the impact of Brexit, which hasn't gone away, but these things were weighing heavily on people's minds, even though we had one of the lowest unemployment numbers. So I think we can absolutely understand that this is going to be a big driver, and how we talk to our consumers and how we position our brands in terms of empathy and sympathy around what their worlds are going to look like is going to be really, really important. Claire, if you wouldn't mind clicking on to the next slide. So the squeezed middle. Now, this was a label that got hotly debated probably over the last few years as we exited the recession, and it's not a very popular term. Having said that, we didn't set out with this research to see if there were any differences from a demographic point of view, but it was absolutely stark at how this 45 to 54-year-old age profile differed from everybody else in the study, quite remarkably so. And that started raising some really interesting questions. So this group is the most value conscious of all groups. They're the least socially conscious of all groups. And they were most likely to want the government to change the tax rates and bans in the 2020 budget. So these are definitely a group of people that were looking a lot different. They also, from a health point of view, were heavy smokers. They were the heaviest drinkers by a long mile. And also they were the least likely group to exercise. So it did start raising something that was quite interesting. And there's a fascinating study that I would recommend you go and read that was published in the Journal of, sorry, I'm just trying to remember, the European Journal of Health Economics toward the end of 2018 that looked at Ireland particularly in terms of the post-recession impact and the correlation that exists to people having endured difficult economic times ultimately drives a health crisis after a recession. And that was certainly playing out in Ireland. And you could argue that this group of people were probably the most affected because they would have been between the ages of 35 and 44 in the midst of the recession. They probably were the ones that bought property at the highest prices, were in negative equity, were at a crunch point in their career during the recession, and probably experiencing one of the sort of highest cost life stages. So it's really interesting to understand how this group of people have had there's been a long-term impact. And as we start thinking strategically about the exit from COVID and what the next few years are going to look at, it becomes really interesting because there's enough evidence now to show that a deep economic recession ultimately has the snowball effect of a health crisis following. We're now facing a health crisis that will have an economic crisis as an output, and then potentially yet another health crisis. So that's worth thinking about. The third thing that I want to talk about, Claire, is the digital pivot. This has been remarkable to watch in terms of the ease that we've pivoted into a digital world during lockdown. The really interesting thing is that this was happening before the lockdown. And I think there was another kind of bump in technological changes that made the space between reality and our digital worlds that much more reduced. And it certainly was playing out before COVID-19 hit us, but it's absolutely exploded. The reason that I have those lovely pictures of Travis Scott there is that I just thought it was such a lovely demonstration. I think some of you will be aware that Travis Scott appeared in the Fortnite game last week and had a little 10-minute concert, which got massive viewerships and obviously did his own brand a great deal of good. It wasn't the first time this has happened on Fortnite. In fact, it happened during the Super Bowl last year with the DJ Marshmallow. But it does show you how quickly we can actually start shifting our entertainment space into those digital worlds. And one of the things that was really interesting that we set out particularly to look at was the take-up of esports, because we've been watching over the last few years esport just exploding as a new kind of economic opportunity, and certainly a really interesting place for brands to play. And it's been growing disproportionately across the world. And we asked Irish consumers how many of them watch esports, and 22% of Irish consumers prior to COVID were actively watching esports. Another 18% were playing esports. And that was really interesting because we've seen this kind of pivot and this of sporting events in terms of digital entertainment happening over the lockdown. And certainly as the real life sport events have been cancelled, big sporting groups are starting to step into this space in a really interesting way. The other really fascinating thing about digital, even though there's been some concerns around security in Zoom and House Party, what we found was that Irish citizens trust their Home Assistant as much as they trust the Irish government. Now, I'm not sure if that's saying something about Home Assistants or the Irish government, but nevertheless, it shows that we're very comfortable in this digital space. If I had the the privilege of being talking to you in real life today, I'd be asking you all to raise your hands in terms of who's created a TikTok over the last few weeks. And it's been really interesting to watch how TikTok has taken off in this environment. But prior to the lockdown, 17% of people in Ireland were active users of TikTok. And it's really interesting, and Claire will take you through some more of this to see how many of the kind of new apps are starting to really take root and grow, and how some of the trust issues around Facebook are certainly starting to change the way consumers think about their digital environment. So that's the three things that we think are really interesting in the context of COVID particularly. And I'm now going to hand over to Claire, who'll take you through some of the more detailed learnings around the research.
So, hi everyone. I'll just take you through initially a little bit of background about the research, and before I take you into some of the more detailed findings. So this piece of research, we surveyed over 1,100 Irish adults aged 15 to 64. And this was done as a recontact of Down Swedish Network's Consumer Connection System survey, which is our annual survey of over 4,000 Irish adults. So as Dale said, we've an absolute wealth of data because this links back to attitudinal and behavioral data way outside what we're talking about today, as well as their consumer media consumption. So some really interesting insights there. In terms of the research itself, I'm going to talk to you about four main themes. That's trust in society, gaming, health and wellness, and sustainable behavior. So starting with trust in society, really bringing this into what Dale was talking about, the digital pivot. So really when we're talking about society here, we're thinking about our new connected society. And starting with devices and the connected home. At the moment, although devices are gaining traction, we're still really at an early adoption stage. So although 34% of us have streaming devices, that trickles down to 6% having a smart home appliance. Though, as you see, when you link this back to our data from last July, this is steadily increasing, and we imagine this number would have continued to creep up since December when the fieldwork was carried out. So looking particularly at those intelligent home assistants, over 2 in 5 of us have an intelligent home assistant in the household, with 18% of people personally using them. So what are we doing when we're using these intelligent home assistants? Predominantly, we're asking questions, we're listening to music, asking for it to search for products. And that brings up a really interesting question. So if we're searching for products and asking questions of these intelligent home assistants, does this mean we're trusting our devices? And I think Dale's already told you that. Really, there's 25% of us that really trust our intelligent home assistant. And that makes sense. It's lower than Google, but actually when it's contextualized with the government, at 26%, they're within a percentage point of one another. And at the time, BNA had government satisfaction at 33%. So actually, people were trusting the government less than they were satisfied with them. And I think that's interesting. And when you trickle down to Facebook, trust is actually really low. And a lot of this, we think, is to do with fake news. There's been a huge amount of media coverage in the last year about fake news and Facebook's algorithm perpetuating it. And actually, 3/4 of people think that fake news is a problem. So we are concerned with it in Ireland. But only 30% of people are checking the accuracy of what they read online, with nearly 1/4 of us rarely or never checking. So nearly 1/4 of people admit to having shared something afterwards that they realized was fake news. And I think that's really interesting. So we're not checking, we're sharing it. And those of us that check afterwards or are checked by someone else are realizing that they're actually just sharing and propagating fake news. And 26% of us check what's shared by friends and family members. And I think we've really learned about this in the spread and debunking of messages during COVID. This is really relevant. Instead, the media, and particularly the journal, is often doing our critical thinking for us, as you can see. So really, like, who's to blame for this spread of fake news? Well, people actually, in the vast majority, blame the publisher of the fake news, which seems pretty fair. But also Facebook is getting a lot of the slack regardless of whether it's actually being spread on Facebook, followed by bots, and actually it trickles down to the Irish government too. So we asked the consumers, who do they think should end it? And actually, again, the publisher of the fake news, but Facebook creeps up as well. So you see this disproportionate effect of the from all the media coverage last year about the perpetuation of fake news on Facebook. And that's really interesting because that has the obvious ramification in terms of trust and people's use of Facebook as an app. And this is really, when we look at this, the impact of fake news, we start looking more broadly at newer apps. So Dale already mentioned this. We've had this big pivot towards technology. We see with Zoom becoming incredibly popular, Telegram, TikTok, and a lot of these newer app disruptors are really gaining a lot of traction at the moment. So we decided we'd take some of the more niche or perceived to be niche apps and have a look at how many people had them on their mobile phones. And actually 34% of people have Reddit, 20% of people have Telegram, and 17% of people have TikTok. And that, I think, is very interesting, particularly when you're thinking about where you put your advertising messages. So looking at Reddit, 59% of them are male and 52% are under 34. When we look at Telegram, which is a cloud-based encrypted messaging service, 56% are under 34. And actually 17% had used TikTok, which is really on par with the TikTok numbers itself, that in the Irish market, they'd recorded 870,000 monthly active users in January. And I really look forward to seeing their release of figures, because they release them quarterly, about what that surge has been during COVID, with 67% under 34 years. So in terms of some of the key takeouts about this trust in society, we have this real reliance on technology, which everyone's particularly aware of during the lockdown. So for communicating, working, shopping, and fact-checking, streaming and the conference technologies have seen a massive surge, and these are likely to have a long-term impact on behaviors. There's also, in terms of streaming, Netflix has doubled the new subscribers compared to their expectations during COVID. And also apps are launching new products like the Netflix Watch Party. However, security is really important, and the backlash in terms of Zoom and House Party shows this importance of consumer trust. And although there have been some issues in terms of Zoom, House Party is saying that actually the hacking is fake news, which brings us to fake news is the new normal. So this is really weird. There's an expectation really now that some of what we read online is going to be fake news. It's not based in truth. So cutting through as a brand is definitely a challenge. And then the new generation of apps. So as marketers, we really need to think beyond Facebook and Google, particularly when Facebook is so impacted in terms of trust. And looking at some of those apps, that really brings us into gaming and esports. So actually what we saw was that 78% of adults play games, which was really unexpected. And when you look at this, this actually doesn't skew younger. It skews actually into our 35 to 44. There's a high percentage of older adults also playing games. And that might seem really counterintuitive. But when you look at the top most popular types of games, they're actually puzzles and educational games, followed by action and adventure sports simulators. And considering that, actually games via mobile apps are the most common, with people who are gaming, 39% are playing on mobile. Whereas 1 in 5 Irish adults are gaming on a laptop, with consoles coming in with 19%, and less than 1 in 10 using a handheld console. And you see that as well in terms of the subscriptions to some of these gaming services. So these are the figures in December, but actually we've seen people have turned much more to gaming during lockdown. There's been an increase of 122% in terms of PlayStation spend, and Xbox spend increased by 86%, according to the Bank of Ireland data. So who are all these gamers and how are they doing it? So actually 60% tend to game alone, but that leaves a really substantial minority who are gaming with other people. So 19% before lockdown tended to game with family or friends in the same room, like multiplayer console games. 13% played with family and friends online, and 8% play against strangers online. So this stereotypical notion of a young adult playing games alone in their room isn't really an accurate picture anymore. There are plenty of older adults playing numerous types of games. While there's also huge online communities who are playing games together. And that really brings us to esports. So as Dale mentioned, 22% of Irish adults have watched esports. And what we see is the reasons for watching esports are very much in line with those who watch sports in a more conventional sense. So entertainment tops the list, followed by getting tactics and strategies to play, understanding more, and hearing the commentary. While 18% of people have actually played esports. And really, when we think about our viewers and also our players of esports, Twitch is one of the most common platforms for esport gaming, and 15% of people have Twitch on their phone. However, obviously during lockdown, COVID-19 led to a 24% increase in Twitch viewership, and Twitch had a record 22.7 million daily users globally in March. So these are their Twitch channels, teams, and communities, while Twitch is also holding concerts. So really, esports and esports platforms are massively expanding, and they're doing a lot more than what we think of conventional gaming. In terms of Twitch users, 71% are male and 68% are under 3-4 years. So really the key takeouts here is gaming isn't niche. 80% are gaming in some form. So not thinking about this as a key channel for engagement is definitely a loss, especially when there's this opportunity for immersion and showing up in a really native way, not just interrupting, but partaking. And also esports is growing fast, so it really needs to be seriously considered. Newzoo forecasts that by 2021, 550 million enthusiasts or participants in esports globally, which we imagine would be most likely accelerated by COVID. So that brings us on to health and wellness. So although it might be somewhat counterintuitive, we wanted to start with smoking and vaping because we had some really interesting figures here. So actually 30% of Irish adults had smoked or vaped in the previous month. And what's really interesting is actually the overlap between these. So when we look at the 320,000 people who'd vaped, actually only 88,000 of those had vaped alone. So although vaping is meant to be a smoking cessation tool, really what we're seeing is this massive combination of smoking. And when we look at our smokers and vapors, what we see is it's massively over-indexing in the 25 to 34 years. So although we've made big progress in terms of reducing smoking in Ireland, it's obviously not good seeing younger people over-indexing. And while we think about cigarettes, self-rolled cigarettes and vapes, cigarettes and rollies tend to have a pretty even gender split, but actually vapes, which are not only skewing younger, are also skewing male. So this is definitely somewhat concerning. Though on the flip side of this, 26% of people say they're most conscious of health when they're selecting a brand, product or service. So we've this strong proportion of Irish adults who are health conscious, placing health above value or the environment when it comes to purchasing decisions. Well, looking at the rest of us, half of us do keep an eye out for healthy products in general. 61% make sure they eat well-balanced and nutritious meals, while 22% of us are actually following a diet with things like gluten-free, then Mediterranean and macro tracking coming in at the top, nice valid diets. Looking at something a little bit different towards diet, actually 1.2 million Irish adults have say they've reduced their meat consumption since last year or already meat-free. So that equates to 33% of us who are meat reducing. 14% of us identify eating with a Tarian label. So that's 6% vegetarian, 6% flexitarian, and then very small proportions coming in as pescatarian and vegan. As Dale mentioned earlier, actually 57% of people regularly exercise. And something that's definitely become apparent during lockdown is that actually walking is the most popular form of exercise, followed by working out and swimming, cycling, whereas actually social media might lead us to believe that it's the following. So, sorry, let's skip on. So really what we see is that a disproportionate amount of our exercise is being done solo, and 27% of us have wearable fitness devices keeping us accountable. So the key takeouts in terms of health and wellness are that 33% of us are meat reducing, which is a great opportunity for brands. Although there's been that big influx of meat-free products in store, all brands could play in the territory in interesting ways. In terms of exercise and community, the 5 biggest exercise activities we're engaging in aren't team sports. So that really opens up an opportunity for brands to play a role and build communities like the Nike Run Club or Kayla Itzines, who's an Australian PT who now has a following of 12.5 million people with local meetup groups. And also health is a concern. So although there are quite a substantial proportion that still smoke, overall, there is a concern about health, and it's creating a void which brands can fill by reframing their position. For example, one of our clients, Leia, have invested heavily in support services, including digital doctor consultations and bespoke clinics. Which brings us into our last section, sustainable behaviours. So 75% of Irish adults are concerned about climate change. As Dale mentioned, 38% have it in their top 3 concerns. And people are trying to make positive actions, like using a reusable water bottle or a reusable coffee cup. Similarly, nearly 2/3 of us have bought previously loved clothes. And many people are trying to continue this loop for at least some of their clothing, with 60% having brought clothes to a charity shop, or 29% asking their circle if they'd like them. And really this openness to pre-loved items has given a huge rise to swap shops and clothes sharing platforms like the New Wardrobe. So 59% as well avoid products with too much packaging because of environmental concerns. And 83% of us recycle as much of our rubbish as possible. And this increases with age, from just over 2/3 of those under 24 to over 90% of those age 45 plus. So 56% say they religiously wash out and recycle containers. But something that was really interesting when thinking about sustainable behaviours was that people don't necessarily know what should be going in the bin. 48% of us think plastic bags can be recycled. They can't. 47% think soft scrunchable plastic can be recycled. It can't either. And this really comes down to information. So 42% of people who say they want to protect the environment say they aren't sure where to go to get impartial information. And this really comes down to our trust and fake news again. So thinking about where brands play in this sustainable sense, 52% like to buy products from brands which have a social and environmental commitment. But be careful, because 59% are cynical about companies who say that their products and services protect the environment. So in terms of our key takeouts here, really, climate change is a concern. People generally are concerned about sustainability and climate change, but behavioral changes are often difficult. There are big barriers in terms of time, effort, and also understanding. People do want to see companies play their part. So 81% said they wanted companies to do more to prevent climate change, but nearly 3 in 5 are cynical. So be cautious. Don't make noises about climate unless your skeletons are transparent. And then also, this isn't just a Gen Z issue. Older people have a greater tendency to recycle. So don't forget that this broad spectrum of people are interested in the environment and sustainability issues. So I'm going to hand you back to Dale just to wrap up.
If you could click on to the next slide, Claire, thank you. Thank you so much, Claire, for delivering an enormous amount of information in a very concise way. If you could skip back to the previous slide. So the last point that we wanted to make before we hand back to David to see if there's any questions is to really just, I guess we moved into this COVID pandemic and the lockdown by surprise, and I think we all needed to react and respond in a very speedy way. But we've got a massive opportunity, because there is almost a certainty that sometime over the next few weeks there will be some form of easing of restrictions, and over the next few months we are going to be exiting from lockdown, and we're going to be exiting into a world that's never existed before. But using data to understand the drivers and motivations behind the way people think about purchasing our brands prior to the lockdown, understanding how people have behaved during lockdown, is all part of helping us form an opinion to understand how consumers might be behaving as we exit from this, and to be able to position our brands in a way that will not only support the recovery of our economies, but also to support our brands in that context. So thank you, everybody, for your time today. And as I said, lots of information, lots more information. So by all means, reach out if there's anything you would like to know more about. It's been great talking to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dale, Dawn, and Claire. Really, I suppose, really interesting information there coming through. And I suppose I might just kick off the questions, should I say, while a few might come through. So please feel free to ask any questions to our experts. But something, Dale, that maybe yourself and Claire could just comment on, the sustainability piece, I think is really interesting. You know, you talked, Dale, earlier on in relation to, I suppose, there not being that detailed knowledge there from a consumer perspective, whatever about their access to it, or getting impartial information. And then similarly, Claire, you spoke about the fact that there's real cynicism to it, that, you know, like I've looked at lots of brands online, and you can see that they're really going down the ethical routes and really making sure that they're demonstrating their sustainability. But like everything else, and we've seen it in COVID-19, some people who are maybe stepping into a space that they shouldn't be, and they're going to get slapped for it, I think, ultimately long term. What are your thoughts on I suppose where that sustainability knowledge is going to come from, and how quickly it may be accelerated up the agenda from a consumer perspective?
So yeah, this has been a fascinating topic, and as I said, Claire and I have actually been working on a much more in-depth study in the sustainable space. The truth is that which sustainability and environmental issues catch fire is one of those things that it's very hard to predict. Just like plastic straws for some reason was the thing that caught consumers' attention. I think the big learning for us in terms of brands and businesses is do the right thing. This is an issue that is not going away. It's no longer going to be something that will retain a sort of superficial level. It is going to be increasingly understood, and brands who are not behaving responsibly in the space will be punished. And brands that do behave responsibly will be rewarded.
Okay, really interesting. And building on this one for you, Dawn. I suppose what Dale said there about doing the right thing, and you referenced the point earlier on about being brave and listening to the wants, needs, and desires of your consumers. I was really interested to pick up on the piece that you said about listening to your consumers, not just from maybe a qual and quant perspective, but also look at the data and the in-store reviews. So where is your head at, I suppose, when you're when you're in the innovation process and everything else and looking to launch, and obviously post-launch as well? What sort of weighting do you put on all of those things? Or is there a rule of thumb you use, or is it literally just a case of gleaning as much information as possible?
Just go at it as hard as possible, and with the time that you've got, depending on your launch timings, just immerse yourself in as many data points as possible. You never know where that kind of silver nugget or golden nugget's going to come from. But also making sure that some of those news sources that I mentioned, they're great for the post-launch review as well as the initial stage of investigatory reconnaissance work. They help you make tweaks further down the track to continuously improve the products that you have launched.
Brilliant. Very good. Very good. I have a few questions coming through here. One for you, Dale. What were the percentages for the other concerns besides health and mental health at the start of your presentation?
So I think the health and mental health was 52%. Climate change together with deforestation was 42%. And poverty, unemployment, and inequality was 35%.
It'll be really interesting to see how that changes post-COVID-19, I have to say.
Yeah.
I have a question here from Rob Mullen. Any thoughts from the team on how easily Irish consumers will adopt to using smart home assistants as devices to make purchases with? Interesting.
I have a very definitive thought, very easily.
Okay.
I think this is going to happen so Dawn, you're laughing at me. I really don't have definitive thoughts. I think the transition to voice commands and getting our shopping ordered that way is going to happen really quickly and really easily.
Wow. I think it almost feels like COVID has really created that tipping point when we've always talked about digital transformation, and I think people maybe we've stumbled somewhat in Ireland to really actually be able to make that leap and talk in real terms and actually make it tangible. But I think actually maybe the ball has been tipped over the hill for us, and it's just a case of speed of adoption now.
I think you're 100% right.
Interesting. Another question here from Rebecca Doherty. Consumers have obviously become increasingly aware of environmental and sustainable issues, with a huge focus on actively reducing packaging consumption. With a heightened awareness on hygiene, particularly within stores, do you expect this to move down the consumer's agenda again?
Thanks, Rebecca. And the answer to that is I don't know. I think, as I said, I think one of two things can happen. I think either environment and sustainability is going to go down dramatically on the agenda as value, safety, and kind of economic survival comes up the agenda. And I'd say almost certainly that will happen in the short term. But I do think that there's going to be something interesting in the slightly longer term that will happen, because we are seeing real differences in our environment as we stop flying around the world and stop driving. And I think that's going to bring into stark reality the impact we're having on the world. So I think quite soon, once we recover from the initial shock of needing to be safe and needing to be economically secure, this will jump back up the agenda really quickly.
Okay, very good, very good. Another question here from Anonymous. Do you have any concerns that businesses will not invest in consumer insights and brand building in the inevitable downturn post-COVID?
No, not particularly. I think, you've got organizations and marketing teams that are always led by consumer insights, and they will remain committed to that, because the benefits of doing so once you've done it are just so obvious. And then you will have organizations that have to make hard choices just to survive. But insights don't need to be expensive.
Agreed.
I think we kind of forget just watching people, just learning stuff. I've read over 50 reports on COVID. There's a lot of information out there. You don't need to invest money to get good insights.
Yeah. And sometimes, yeah, I'm a firm believer in, you know, you almost know the answers sometimes to these things, and you're just looking for that validation. And I've always been a firm believer in you trust your gut to a degree. Dawn, I'm sure you're probably the same. Ultimately, when you're about to kick off a product.
Yeah, and there's, you know, the classic triangulation of data. You know, take your gut, take some free data and insight, and do a little bit of the hard stuff as well. And there are many ways to get there, and I would say that people that do cut their insights budgets would be foolish.
And one last thing: know when it's about research and when it's about a decision. Quite often we tend to go and lean into research when actually what we need to be doing is making a decision.
Such a valid point. Such a valid point. Listen, I think we've just gone over the hour. What can I say? My God, Dawn, from if nothing else, from the simplicity of your messages around strategy and the importance of effectively understanding the wants and needs and desires of your consumers is just brilliant, and ultimately turning those storytelling into consumer truths. I think, you know, never a truer word said to get an organization all focused in the right way. Dale, I'm very concerned about being in the squeezed middle. I'll have to get a clear definition of what that means. I'm obviously on just at the edge of the squeezed middle. I'll let everybody know. But really, really interesting. And again, that shift from health and well-being, climate change, and poverty, stroke and unemployment. Will be interesting to see how they move now post-COVID. Yeah. And I have to say, Claire, just in relation to, I suppose, some of the things you talked to about, I suppose, the key takes about the reliance on tech. I think, yeah, I think it's back to that point. Fake news as normal. Jesus, you know, I'm watching more CNN than I've ever watched. So, you know, I think that says it all.
Stop.
Yeah, I should stop. And finally, I suppose, just that I really kind of wonder, Claire, about that adoption of gaming and things like that. And will we see a slow? And I'm assuming we're going to see a slowdown in the adoption, because obviously, you know, the circumstances we're in, it's been accelerated beyond everybody's expectations, I suppose.
Yeah, it's definitely true to say there may be a slowdown, but I think there's probably a pocket of consumers that never would have got into gaming in the first place that actually are replacing their traditional maybe sport watching or things like that, and are going to continue in that space. So I think probably COVID has just propelled a new segment of the population into online gaming and esports.
Brilliant. Well, listen, guys, what can I say? Thank you so much for a really, really interesting insight into what lies ahead of us post-COVID, and we're certainly seeing a lot of it come to the fore in the last few weeks. So, Dawn, thank you very much. Dale, really appreciate it, and Claire as well. Thank you all, and thank you everybody for attending. I hope I'm sure you took a lot out of it. Thanks.